Welcome to the Dial Global Virtual Lounge. This is a show where we discuss the future of the modern workplace and the impact of diversity, inclusion and belonging with the world's most successful and innovative business leaders. Today, we have a phenomenal panel for you. We're joined by three seasoned and successful non-executive directors. They are Dierdre O'Reilly, Mary Brennan and Penelope Kenny. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Leila.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Thank you so much for joining me. And all three of you have a phenomenal background and sit with a number of different hats on, wide-ranging portfolios within an array of different organisations with the portfolio non-exec director positions and also chairs. Now, before we kick off into today's discussions in the lounge, it would be really wonderful to hear a little bit about each of you respectively in your personal experiences, essentially how you came to be where you are today, juggling all of these different portfolio pieces. And Penelope, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay.
Thank you, Leila. Yeah. Thank you. Well, so my background and where I came from and how I got to, in a nutshell, I am a chartered accountant, and that was my first professional qualification. And shortly after qualifying, I became chair of the Leinster Society and subsequently council of the Institute of Chartered Accountants. That was really a first representative role, which I learned a huge amount from and thoroughly enjoyed. So having taken some time to build my career in between that, I then became very interested in non-executive directorships, and currently I have a nice portfolio. And of course the lovely thing about having a portfolio of non-executive directorships is that you can of course build in all your passions, all your hobbies into it. And whereas I do sit on state bodies and large property organisations, one of my passions is arts and culture, and I sit and very proud to be on the board of the Irish Museum of Modern Art, IMA, which of course we would be very proud to be recognised with the Tate from time to time as well. And so the lovely thing about the sort of work that we do is that you've got a portfolio of things that you can enjoy and develop. I sit on quite a number of large audit and risk committees and chair some of them at the moment. I find that extremely rewarding. It plays to my accountancy skills, and that is just one of the bigger chunks of my portfolios. So that's really who I am and what I do, and I have to say I feel privileged to be doing what I do, and I love it.
Thank you so much, Penelope. I love the Tate as well. I love art. I think it's brilliant that you're managing to interweave the creative facets into all the work that you do. And Mary, what about yourself?
Leila, I'm a chartered accountant as well, actually, and a chartered director and a certified investment fund director. So I believe in continuous education, and I think that that's really important. It is, setting a role as well at a role model kind of piece at the board. That everyone needs to be continually improving and perfecting their knowledge in their different areas. So I have a portfolio of directorships. I would look at my career, which started in one of the large accounting firms. I look at it in 3 decades, right? So the first decade was external audit, and then financial accountant, management accountant. My second decade was traveling the world, because being a chartered accountant gives you such freedom to travel the world. So I traveled to 4 continents, working in all of them. And so I worked and I've always worked in big multinationals. And, I saw from way back when then how successful women were throughout the world, and made sure that I tried to be as equally as successful then when I came back home. And then the last decade of my career, most current one, is as non-exec director. Audit committee chair, risk committee chair, all approved by the financial regulator. and really, really enjoy the work. And every different company is different, like everything is different. You know, there are similarities, right, and synergies, right, but still in all, there'll be different things happening. So it's such an exciting job to have, and I love it. And that's my background. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Mary. I love the fact that you talk about all around the world and all these these cultural experiences we can pick up along the way. I think it's so important to have the opportunity to see how different cultures interact and to be able to glean from lots and lots of different places. And last but definitely not least, Dierdre.
Hi, Lelia. Thank you very much for having me on this discussion. One thing we obviously all have in common is being a qualified chartered accountant, because I also have a background in chartered accountancy as training. And in terms of, I suppose, that as a starting point, it was an excellent starting point, because as a qualification, it can lead to very flexible opportunities. So it's quite a broad qualification to have as an entry point. So I trained with PwC and experienced, I suppose, as a starting point, you tend to start with audit and you experience various types of businesses, but I did specialize in the financial services sector in that training program, and also with other opportunities that I worked in after I qualified. So for me, it was a natural segue to move into the regulatory arena. So I worked for quite some time in the Central Bank of Ireland, regulating institutions based in Ireland. So obviously all financial services related. So it seemed like a natural shift for me to go into the INED world, because certainly often you need, for chair of audit committee roles, you need to be a qualified chartered accountant. And in my experience as a supervisor in the central bank, you're constantly having to review a range of issues for regulated institutions, from obviously assessing their business model down to more granular issues. So for me, it was kind of a natural progression to move into the INED world, because I feel I had been training for it pretty much all my life. So it certainly felt like a natural fit for the next move in my career. But I'm certainly interested in the fact that Penelope mentions the arts, and for me that is the attraction both to the qualification I chose and also this particular move into this world of INED, an INED career, because it gives you flexibility and it also gives you variety, which is the huge attraction for me, is that you don't necessarily have to specialize in one sector. It's the skill set that you're building. So that's why I like it so much.
Thanks so much for sharing, Dierdre, and for all of you for sharing. I think it's it's fascinating to hear. Not only have you had decades worth of experience starting off in to a degree similar places, all qualified accountants, then obviously rising to the top where you are right now and having that variety and eclectic mixture of insight into various different sectors and experiences. And I'd be really curious, I guess, to hear, because not all, and I know I'm pulling out gender here as one facet of diversity inclusion, just one, which is obviously a visible diversity, of which there are many of those. But fascinated to hear some of your personal experiences around those last couple of decades. Was it, for those looking from the outside in, how difficult was it to get to where you are? I think, when I was looking at some statistics earlier, there is great diversity of gender in your grassroots level, but it starts to peter off as you rise up the ranks, and it starts to diminish, unfortunately, when you get up to the top. It's clearly not an easy stretch to get to where you are right now. I wonder, what have your observations been over, say, last couple of decades when it comes to diversity and inclusion, and maybe in particular gender? And were there any inspirations almost, or even particular challenges that stick out to you that you remember over your career that that really spurred you on to get to where you are right now?
Yeah, I don't know if I can interject. Certainly, in terms of my initial stage of my career as a trainee chartered accountant, I think it was really important to have the visibility of role models ahead of you, and to give you a sense of how much the environment has shifted in that time. There were very few female partners in the firm that I was connected with at that stage. whereas now I understand it could be almost 50-50 in terms of female-male partnership scenarios. So it's changed quite dramatically from what I might have experienced in my initial stages of my career. That said, I do work in financial services, and in general it does tend to be quite a heavily male-dominated environment as you get into the more senior positions. And certainly I experience working on boards where I'm the only female director, so that's an interesting scenario to be in. But you know, I think certainly I also am experiencing institutions, and I'm involved and work with institutions where I work with female CEOs. So it's definitely, I think we're at that point in time where it's definitely shifting to the positive.
That's great to hear.
Well, I picked that up. Yeah, well, actually, when I started, which is a little bit earlier than Dierdre, a little bit older, there was no female partners in any of the accounting firms. And not only that, there was no thought that there ever would be. Yes, there was no role models and there was no appetite. And it was a completely different environment. And if you didn't play rugby, you probably wouldn't get promoted as quickly as others. It was a completely different environment. I'm so glad that things have changed. But it actually was when that second decade of my career, when I went traveling the world and I saw successful women in boardrooms in America. I remember being in Dallas for Occidental Petroleum and looking up and seeing this lady, and she was middle-aged and she was in the boardroom, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. It was a beautiful room, glass everywhere, and we could see it. It was in the middle of the office and it was high up and we could see them all up there. I was like, oh, that's fantastic. So, you know, I think that it's high time we got to where we were. I do think that we need to keep our foot to the pedal on it. I do think there's a certain thought that, oh, well, 20% or 30% is enough. I mean, we are 50% of the population. So, you know, and we need to encourage everybody. And so, like, I think all of us, right, you'll hear today, have got involved in helping, in speaking, in mentoring, taking phone calls, encouraging. I've spoken to groups, the Institute of Internal Auditors, told them all, 50 of them there on Valentine's Day 2 years ago, to become board directors because they challenge, right? So, you know, people need to look at their skill sets they're building and how it's adaptable to the boardroom. But I'll be quiet now for a minute because I know I've said a bit.
I should contribute my piece, which was probably around the same time that Mary is talking about. But I was asked to sit on a group called Women in Accountancy many years ago, and I was representing the Institute of Chartered Accountants in Ireland. And that was an extremely interesting group, probably way ahead of its time. And all of the accounting institutes in these islands, England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, were trying to come up with the big questions, which is, we want women to be represented. Why are they not? So I think at that stage, the Institute of Chartered Accountants were realizing, look, this is a professional qualification. There is no reason why we aren't 50-50. So what are we doing wrong? And there was quite a lot of willingness and worry, actually, on behalf of the men who Mary talked about as being, you know, all of them in this classroom with one woman there. There was quite a lot of interest and willingness on their part to say, how do we do this? And I think really it upsets me that today, whereas we've had quotas and we've had, you know, laws, is that we still, that group of women in accountancy identified at that stage that we need to change societal attitudes. We need to go way beyond the stretch where we are now. And rather than sort of see women as being special and wonderful, we need to see them as being essential. And so it's for us, I think, to build that societal change in attitudes. And I think that that's what's going to bring us to the next stage, where we don't start celebrating, isn't this amazing? And we start to assume, and we judge people on their own merits. And I suppose if I was to go on about this, and I'm sure I will later on as well, is that we often judge women's contribution through a male lens, through a lens that has been developed over the last 100 years, that judges people on the basis of how many goals they scored, or what's their performance measure, did they achieve this and that. Whereas I think that we need a different lens to judge people by, and to assess our leaders by. And I think when we start to do that, that women and men will emerge equally, rather than on women playing on a playing field that isn't actually built for them. So if this conversation goes anywhere today, if we develop this conversation today, I hope it will develop in a place where we start to identify the measures, the leadership measures that we have identified many years ago, and I still think we're still struggling with them.
This is such a valuable point, and really valuable points from all of you there. I absolutely concur. The level, the playing field is absolutely not level, and I think it is, it's fantastic to celebrate women and for us to be able to put women in positions of power, but no woman wants to feel that they have been put there just because they are a woman at the same time. And you're absolutely right. Your point, Penelope, is systemic kind of systemic learned behaviour, societal issues that have brought us to this point. And so how can we do that through real actionable measures, structures and processes that will actually bear fruit in the right way? But what's interesting there, and I think also inspirational, if I may say, you've often and number of years ago, there's always going to be people who are the first people paving the way, the first women, and obviously that improves over time. But Dierdre, you mentioned there as well, first woman. I'm sure you all have been in a situation where you have been the only woman. I have, and it was with one of the big four, because I used to do the roundtables with a partner who's a great friend of mine, and once realised, oh my God, the only woman here, and they're all a bit older than me, and I suddenly felt this mass kind of shrinking feeling of just intimidation and imposter syndrome. But I wonder, you're all far more qualified than I, with far more experience, but how did you feel in those moments? Did that affect you and your feelings? And do you think it would have been different if there were other visible women there who were in that environment? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, if I can start off, certainly I think probably anyone in a minority situation does feel some sort of sense of, it's sort of a human instinct to go, oh God, I'm the only one here, and feel slightly intimidated by it. I suppose for me, and I'm sure Mary and Penelope would say the same, because I chose accountancy as my training, and possibly at that stage would have been an element of male dominance in that particular sector, and then obviously then choosing in terms of sector, financial services. I've always experienced an element of certainly minority from a gender perspective, and I suppose you get used to it and you learn to be braver and learn to almost ignore that, and that no longer becomes the issue. But it's definitely a conversation worth having in terms of how to cope and how to deal with that initial reaction to those situations. And I'd welcome your thoughts on it and any guidance you may have, because I think people are always trying to develop and always trying to grow and be braver. And certainly in this particular role as an INED, your remit and your responsibility is to challenge. So you do have to be brave in the role. So I definitely would welcome your thoughts on that particular conversation.
Certainly a lot of people say that it's great to have a woman on the board, but if you have a big enough board, you really need two women to inform the others' comments and conversations. Not that they're going to group together at all, but that you just hear two voices, even if they're for example, in disagreement with each other, that they're just two people there and that you have a momentum. And that may well be what part of what Dierdre was mentioning there. And certainly for myself, being the only woman, you do seem to be sometimes a lone voice, and you depend on others to listen to you. And I mean, this applies to anything. As Dierdre said, this applies to race and any other minority group. But it's much easier when there are a group of similar voices to yours. You know, sometimes at board meetings, you look to your supporters and you say, well, I know they're going to agree with me. I'll bring up this point. But even so, if there's a woman there and she's in disagreement with you, you know that in some way that voice will inform you. You will not be a completely lone voice there in the way you speak about things, I think.
Well, you know, I went to a convent, and then I went to the BCom in UCD, and way back when, in the 1980s, there was a class of about 350, of which 50 were women and 300 were men, in and around that sort of ratio. I don't have it exactly, right? So, you know, I actually learned way back then to get very comfortable in the company of men. I didn't even know how to talk to them. And all you have to do is ask them questions, and they're quite happy to talk about themselves. So it's, you know, it's, to me, I have learned a lot of skills about talking to people and listening to people. And that's really, we were all just people at the end of the day. But what I do see in a boardroom, which is, you know, can be a little bit troublesome for me, is that you're often not the only woman in the boardroom, because there are other women in the room, and it looks like there's an equal say, but some of the other women in the room may be in the different fields, right? So there might be the company secretarial, might be the accountant, might be a lawyer, and absolutely. So I feel that I'm acting as a role model for them, right? But I also think that the men sometimes are a little bit confused that there's a bigger gender balance in the room than there actually is, because the votes are counted among the board members. So yeah, I think we need to be careful about that. Just because there's a lot of women in the room doesn't mean they're on the board. And so just, you know, the optics looks right, but the voting power isn't there. And so I think we need to be careful. And as I know another CEO, I won't mention him by name, he said, why can't we be the 50% club? Right? You know, like we were aiming for the 30%. I think the state bodies in Ireland are aiming for the 40%. But what about the 50% club? Like, we have a long way to go. And we're all ambitious, and you know, and we should be ambitious for everybody. Also, there's more to diversity, and we'll come on to that, than just gender.
I absolutely concur, and it'd be great to explore some of the other areas of diversity, because there's many invisible diversities, of course, as well. You know, we could have a board of white males who actually is incredibly diverse from very different places, because really what we're after is that diversity of mindset, isn't it? So we don't have the groupthink scenario, but obviously visible diversity is very important when it comes to role models, and I like to call them sometimes real models. But to pick up on some of the points that you mentioned about, you know, maybe being the only one, or being one of minority, and you know, I absolutely empathise that, because I felt it numerous times, is, and I heard a very interesting statistic the other day that said anything less than 30% within a group in a minority, be it women, be it Asian, Black, ethnic, etc., they spend that amount of time trying to fit in. They spend that amount of time in terms of their energy worrying about and trying to fit in. And it really made me reflect, and I thought, oh my goodness. And, you know, that has been true. You know, I don't know if it's been true for all of you, but it certainly has been true for me many a time, because I'm just thinking more about, you know, do I fit in here? Do I feel right here? And actually, you know, imagine how many other people are feeling like that, be it women in boardrooms, be it others in boardrooms who feel they're the lone voice. Actually, to a degree, numbers is power. And so over 30%, there is the confidence to be able to speak up and, you know, feel actually you aren't, you know, that one lonely person by yourself not having a voice. But imagine the impact that could then have on productivity. Because if that 30% worth of, you know, energy that's spent worrying goes into being productive, you know, imagine where we could be. No, it is absolutely, you've all alluded to it. No, this is not just a nice to have, this is an absolute business imperative. I think you said, Mary, we are 50% of the population as women, and of course, we identify as many different things. I identify as BAME as well, and mental health I can identify with, all these invisible diversities. But I wonder, your thoughts, because you all touched on that, positive allyship is what I would call it. You have a CEO who's saying, come on, let's make this. And I'm not saying that was a male CEO, it could have been a male or female, saying it was a male CEO. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And we have these fantastic male allies, and some of the best champions I've had, have been guys. There haven't always been women. There's not been as many women to necessarily go to, and so there can be fabulous allies and people that are involved. You don't have to be female to get involved in moving the dial, which is great. And clearly you've all had brilliant allies there, and you look to your nearest supporters. I think you'd also said Penelope and Dierdre in these environments. I wonder your take on, obviously forming cross-functional partnerships at board level, at senior leadership level. Have you any examples of how these have played out, and how important are these when it comes to really fostering a culture that can allow us to move forward? And I don't just mean as, gathering up other ethnic minorities or gathering up, allies are just as important when it comes to making an impact.
Will I pick up on that one? Very good. Just from my point of view, as Audit Committee Chair for FBD Insurance, we have a lovely mix of skills. So as Chair, I'm a Chartered Accountant. We have an actuary on the Audit Committee, and we also have an insurance veteran, right? Not from Ireland, right? From Belgium. So, I think that mix of skills really helps to challenge what's been brought to us. The other side, where I thought on the executive side, was, we have reporting to us, we have functions like audit and risk and compliance. And so this year they got together to form a risk assurance map. So things like that. So we're increasing our collaboration, improving our thought processes. It helps innovation as well when you have cross-functional teams. Yeah. And I also see a lot more HR input into nominations, or into not only nominations, but also remuneration committees. Yeah. I see more IT input into risk committees. Yeah. And all of that is really important, because we have so many things to try and wrap our arms around nowadays. So I think we're on the right path.
Mm-hmm. And I agree, and I would go back to the point of, the worry that you go into a room and you say, I'm the only woman there. And I think that there's no reluctance on the part of men to include. I think we've gone way beyond the stage where anybody feels women are being deliberately excluded, certainly in our part of the world. I think there's a huge amount of willingness and recognition around the world. This is very important. I think it's now up to the whole world not to look at it as being a divide amongst women and men, but a changing of the way we look and the way we evaluate our leaders, so that we actually have the words to describe. Currently we're using words even to describe male leadership attributes, or yes, I suppose male leadership attributes, probably for everybody, and this is even with race included in there. And I want to change the way the words that we use and the evaluations that we make. And I think that that's going to come with a lot of thinking and training and understanding over time, and a consciousness of where we go next with this. Because I do see, and I think both Dierdre and Mary have talked, but there is a lot of willingness. We do have plenty of partners. There's a lot of willingness to create this a diversity and inclusion platform on a widespread basis. So it's now getting us to it, moving along to the next phase.
If I may add as well, just to come back to your original question about and your comments about building allies, I suppose in terms of, being a fairly new entrant to the INET world, certainly it was great for me to have the support of other female directors who supported me in my role in the early stages. And one of those, I can say I share a board with Mary, and she was a great support to me. So I think it's really important to, back to our original conversation, to have role models that you can touch base with, and like you say, or like you mentioned, have allies, and certainly for the initial stages to build that network and to build the opportunities. I think what Mary was saying about skill set, I would agree and fully support what she said, in that assuming then you have gained opportunities and you've been appointed to a board, it's really what's more important is what is that variety of skill set, and will it lead to productivity for the institution, and will the right decisions and contributions be made by the people who are on the board. And certainly what I'm observing or seeing is that certainly there's a great encouragement from the central bank to see a chief technology officer on the boards of regulated institutions, and I'm working with a UK-based client where the CTO is newly appointed to the board. So certainly, even in terms of variety of skill set, I think it's really important to see that. And just on Penelope's last point in terms of evaluations, I mean, obviously there's a lot in the market in terms of building a strong culture and a strong conduct risk framework, and I think really that's the key to develop and encourage the right behaviours. And so when we talk about, I suppose, encouraging inclusivity and diversity, having the right framework in place hopefully will encourage those sort of behaviours.
Yeah, absolutely.
Some really great points there, and I would love us to touch on other aspects of diversity and inclusion. I know we mentioned race there as well, but religion is a very key piece. The number of these pieces I still notice these days slightly taboo. There's a lot of talk about the new normal and the new workplace, and bringing your full self to work. I'm sure you have all heard an abundance of late, and I thought to myself the other day, what does that really mean? Bringing your full self to work, because there's so many different idiosyncratic details that make us up as human beings. To your point, Mary, we are all humans. We're just all humans. At the end of the day, if you strip everything else off, we're beating hearts and souls and everything like that. How can we bring our full selves to work, and what does that mean? Because there's many invisible diversities and visible diversities, and of course race is absolutely key at the moment, given all the terrible things happening in the States and the wider world. But it is ultimately collective responsibility with all of us, just shouldn't fall onto one or a few people. But I wondered what your thoughts were when it came to other aspects of diversity and inclusion, also the theme of bringing your full self to work. What any of your observations perhaps were with that, and whether there is comfort in talking about some of these other visible and invisible diversities and what they may mean to you.
Will I take that? Very good. Well, I was actually on a webinar yesterday listening to a group talk about the nominations committee process, and the group was the Irish Fund Directors Association. And there is a recruitment firm called Audit, and they are absolutely excellent. Their whole idea is about getting diverse people on the board, and not just gender. And so they asked the questions. We talked to them, and we asked how do you make sure you get the full diversity there? And you have to ask questions. So when you join up with them, you're asked to tick certain boxes. So the question is asked, all of those questions that are asked. But the other thing that was mentioned yesterday, which I thought was brilliant, was that diversity is not lowering the bar, it's widening the net. Right? And that is so key to understand that, we can't be fishing out of the same small pond, right? We have to widen our nets and make sure we include everybody. And if we don't, if we're seen to be old and stale and a certain, mindset, right? Put it like that, people will move into different industries. They won't want to be like, you know, there are some industries that were very male dominated in the past that aren't so much now, and really shouldn't be, because if they are, all the female talent will move, and they will move somewhere else to maybe a more creative type industry. So we need to be very, very careful on that.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'm involved in an organisation called 100 Women in Finance. They have a next gen peer group, and what's interesting is, well, it's very encouraging to see that women are still interested in financial service and are very passionate about it. But I would agree that you need to move at quite a speedy pace nowadays to remain innovative and to retain talent and interest from the next generation. So I totally agree with what Mary's saying, that it's just part of the course and part of where any industry needs to be nowadays, and particularly in Ireland. You know, we are competing quite a lot with the tech sector, which is obviously often seen or perceived as a highly more exciting industry to be involved in, being in the financial services sector myself. But the two are overlapping a lot now. You see a lot of fintech organisations in Ireland being authorised, so they're very much merging. But definitely innovation in order to encourage the next generation is important.
Yeah, and certainly to go back to the point made about bringing your whole self to work, which we think of as being sometimes very funny. I feel as a non-exec director that that is a place where you do have to bring your whole self to work, and it is continuously challenging, not just what Dierdre and Mary were talking about, in being continuously up to date and looking for the innovation and making sure that you're always ahead in terms of that innovation, but also drawing on all of the skills that I have learned, that I've technically learned, for example, as an accountant, but also all of the skills that you gain with kind of wisdom and experience. And I think that is one of the absolute pleasures of being a non-exec director, is that you don't know at what, you know, sometimes you make a comment or a point at one, you go, where did I actually get that from? And it's from a mixture of training, education, experience, and just world skills, and you realize that was actually a very good point, you know. So rolling it back and realizing that's the moment I've in fact brought my whole self to work, which is a very nice place to be. The other thing I think on boards where you can draw out other people bringing their whole of themselves to work, I think is the very interesting place of board committees, where you can pick and choose who you'd like to be, particularly if you're chair. Of course, you get the great job sometimes of inviting people onto your committee. And of course, what you look for there is not kindred spirits, but very much people who will disagree with me. And I particularly like that, where I'm doubling the skills by having another person on, and again by having more people on. And you end up with a subcommittee that is really, really humming in terms of what it can contribute and the good decisions that it can work through. So I think that those are areas of really enjoying the full self to work, and and appreciating the diversity of different views and skills.
That's a great point. I think it's that listening, it's that appreciation that we all have our different backgrounds, and being able to bring them into the mix, which, you know, as you've all alluded to, you know, fast forwards innovation a lot of the time, which is obviously great for business, having these different mindsets within the boardroom environment. And you know, I love that you've all mentioned there as well, peer-to-peer learning and sharing. I think that is absolutely the future. It is proven the fastest way to accelerate diversity and inclusion and belonging within workplaces is by sharing and learning from one another, and being inclusive in and to itself. But I think also very interesting points you mentioned there about our next generations, you know, do see the world of work, I think, in a very, very different place, in a very different way, I should say, about how they feel, and it is about working for organizations that have got a true passion. They mean what they say. They aren't just empty words. They are full of inspirational and thought-provoking leaders who have humanity and best business practice at the heart, ultimately, which is what you're all doing. And I think it's a very, very interesting time for workplaces as a whole, especially given the current environment, and watching what happens as our new leaders come up and start to put their heads above the parapets and what have you. And great for them to be guided and mentored and inspired by yourselves.
Can I just interrupt on that point, because I think that to that point, that's what's so refreshing about working with the next generation for me, is seeing how different in some respects they are, in that when I was training as an accountant, the unfortunate scenario may have been that some women felt they had to be somebody else in order to get to those senior positions, and sacrifice a lot, including family circumstances or whatever the case may be. Whereas you can recognize with the next generation, they don't feel that way at all. They feel entitled to have both and be able to enjoy both, which I think is great to see, and I'm completely encouraged by it. And so I know that you wanted to raise or discuss to some extent the current environment that we're existing in with COVID and workplace flexibility, and I think they certainly would expect to be supported in certain stages of their career, whether it be when they take time out to have family or whatever, that there is opportunities to be flexible. So I think it's wonderful that both institutions and organisations are willing to embrace that, and also that is an expectation of that generation, and that it's allowed to be discussed.
And I think that open transparency of knowledge is fantastic. I wonder your thoughts around, this so-called new normal. What improvements could be made to workplace flexibility, and what can we do to continue to support our respective teams during these, quite unprecedented times, shall we say?
I think long have we wished to be judged on our output and our productivity and our contribution, rather than the bums on seats attitude of 9 to 5. So this has really broken that wide open. I don't think anybody wants to actually see me physically at a desk anymore. I think they're more than happy to appreciate my contribution wherever and whenever I give it, and I really welcome and embrace that. And I, for others, so grateful that they are there when needed, and that I don't have to. I mean, this idea of supervising being physically there I think is completely gone, and it also is going to create a new lens for us to evaluate leadership through, because it isn't looking at a leader, it's seeing the results of great leadership, and I think that's going to be fantastic.
It's a very powerful point indeed.
I agree. I would say even that expectation of being at a desk 9 to 5 can lead to the opposite of productivity. An expectation to be there without necessarily any goals is not the way forward. So I think it's wonderful that we do have the opportunity to take calls or have meetings from anywhere in the world, that we're more connected. All of those positives of technology are fantastic. I think it would have been quite a traumatic experience without technology, the whole experience of COVID. So thankfully, we have that to have helped us along the way.
I feel that I have been lucky to have been working like this for the last decade. So when you move into the INED role, it is much more about being at home, working from home, receiving thousands of pages that you need to go through, thinking about your work, and having much more control over your time, right? Like when you sit on a board, they try and plan the calendar year in advance. And often it will be the female on the board who will say, oh, no, we can't have a board meeting on Good Friday, right? Or, because
break.
we're very conscious of the school calendars, right? And so there's little nuances like that. I mean, I remember my first board directorship when I was 44, and I'm giving away my age there now. But I had to get the kids up in the morning, get them fed, get them to the creche, and then turn up looking fantastic, if I could possibly do that, right, at the board meeting, right? And I knew that everybody else on the board who was there didn't have to do all of that work before they started their day, right? And so, you know, there is a lot that we do, and we should pat ourselves on the back for doing it. But we want to achieve, and we want to be at the table, and that's what it takes then.
Yeah, and I think as well, if we judge from this pandemic, if we are evaluating people through the lens of what they've produced, the idea of flexing our work day is going to be wonderful. The idea that, you know, okay, so this is a busy decade for me, I'm going to do extra work at different times. I think that'll be wonderful. And you know, if I'm not evaluated on turning up at the same time at 9 o'clock every morning, for example, or an early meeting for 7 o'clock, if I can zoom into that, or using technology, do that from home, that'll be very helpful, I think, for people in the situation that Mary discussed, and very fair way to carry to run our workplace.
Yeah, completely agree.
I absolutely concur. I think it will open us up to potentially even other talent as well. And you all alluded to earlier, you know, the war for talent, quote unquote. You know, it is a competitive world. Those, you know, the millennials, the zillennials who are picky when it comes to organizations and the ethoses those organizations have and everything like this, actually, because we'd be tapping into a whole sphere of other talent in other places, not limited to where we necessarily need to be for our headquarters 9 to 5.
Yeah.
Single day of the week, you know, could improve social mobility. Who knows? You know, it could allow us to tap into to you know, unfound talent, or, you know, as you all said, you know, why is there a necessity to be, you know, in one place at the exact same time every single day? Actually, we've proven now that it is possible. And finally, before we wrap up for today, you know, I wondered, because you've all brought to the table so many great you know, suggestions and shared so many great stories from all of you. I wonder, you know, some final thoughts really for other non-exec directors or aspiring non-exec directors and aspiring leaders ultimately. What can we do to positively impact diversity, inclusion and belonging within the boardroom environment, and even further beyond that? Because I think you're all champions in your own right. You all are influential within your respective organizations. For others who are listening in today, what can be done? Because ultimately this is a shared collective responsibility for us all to keep moving the dial.
Well, I chaired I was the inaugural chair for the Diversity Committee of the Irish Funds Directors Association. So we form associations and we take leadership roles in moving the diversity agenda, right? And it's not just diversity of thought, it's not just diversity of gender, it's diversity of thought, of background, of culture, of color, of everything. Now that's the goal. And I still sit on the committee, but I don't chair it anymore. I think as well, encouraging people into the boardroom. So you know, as I said before, I've spoken to groups where I encourage them to consider being on a board as a career path that they mightn't consider. I think there's a board for everybody, right? And I think everybody should sit on a board, right? So if you are passionate about something, maybe think about how you could contribute at the highest possible level in that area. And then, you know, you're going to really enjoy it. So that's, you know, I wish you the best of luck. And if you ever need any help, let me know.
I am almost tired at this stage of hearing people talk to me about, oh, I started a thesis on looking at boards, and I ended up changing my mind completely and saying, actually, we need quotas. And certainly when I was appointed onto women in accountancy many years ago at this stage, And we said, oh, you know, things need to change, and everybody at the time was saying, oh, we have to. And yet today we're still struggling with even looking at how many, you know, looking at the percentages. So I think at this stage, along with a whole lot of other people who have done a lot of more research than I have, I think we have to actively encourage. The Irish government, when they were setting up the Public Appointment Service, which they did only a few years ago now, said we are actively trying to balance the quotas, and that has had mixed results, but it has had results. So I do think, for me anyway, at this stage, and I admit to being a little bit cross here, is that I think I'd like to come out in the open and say, look, folks, if you don't actually fess up to this and take action now and address the problem with either quotas or active recruitment, that you're going to end up taking one step forward, two steps back. And, you know, saying nice things like, oh, it's all wonderful, you know, we have a woman on a board, that is not good enough. So cross me coming out here and saying, consider quotas, consider active interventions. And as Mary's talking about, you know, the actively training and the proactively going out and saying these things. I think if we don't do that now, we're going to miss the boat completely, and we're going to end up with perhaps a big recession where we know that women tend to go back, reverse back a bit, and not go out into the world as much because the opportunities are less. So yes, if I might voice a strident note there, please.
I like a strident note, and I like cross you, Penelope. Dierdre.
No, just to add, really, I suppose I should say I'm not a huge fan of quotas. In that, obviously, in an ideal world, I like to believe that, you know, women were recognised onto a board for their capabilities and their skill set. But I would agree to some extent with Penelope that you do have to influence it. And I suppose government and legislative processes really are the major influencer there. You know, they hold the cards in terms of shifting that dynamic. And certainly in Ireland, the central bank are quite vocal about encouraging women onto boards of regulated institutions. And, you know, there is developments in terms of the non-financial disclosure type regimes to, say, large companies and PLCs, which hopefully will encourage the right sort of conversations and encourage institutions to look towards diversity and you know, from that perspective, it sort of evolves naturally, I suppose. I definitely think you don't necessarily want to just feel that there's finger pointing, you know, that, you know, somebody was appointed to a board to fill a quota, but and maybe doesn't actually have the skill set to perform the role. But I do agree, there has to be a large degree of encouragement.
Thank you all so very much. You've been phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal, all of you. And by way of summary, I always do a little summary at the end, but I think we've actually ended on some incredibly powerful words and formidable words, actually, if I wouldn't, you know, if you don't mind me saying so. I do concur as well. I think quotas, unfortunately, is not a very nice word. No one likes the word quotas, but actually active, proactive interventions, not enough is being done. The playing field was never level. Therefore, we must use our influence collectively and our power collectively to influence, shape, motivate, inspire, educate others, utilize our allies, as you've all mentioned throughout this conversation, which I think has been wonderful, but also really inspiring the next generations. Each and every one of us can be a role model and a real model in our respective rights. And to use a piece that you just said, Mary, actually, everyone should be on a board. There is a board for everyone. I love that. I'm going to use that again and quote you. But everyone should be on a board. Everyone has an opportunity to be on a board. The world is in a very, very different place than it once was. There are opportunities out there. All three of you are absolute role models paving the way for the future. And I truly believe that it is through collaborating, it is through peer-to-peer sharing, it is through, sometimes showing our vulnerabilities and showing other people that we are humans and that it is okay to speak out, it's okay to ask, for help and support. That is what is really going to really be able to kind of get us through this time and to really improve diversity on all different levels. So thank you ever so much. I won't go on with my summary because I could talk through all over again quite happily, but you've all been fantastic. I'd like to, for those who perhaps would like to watch this on demand or have missed any of the key points throughout the conversation, don't worry, we're going to put them all into the show notes at the end of today's show, so you can catch up on demand. Visit www.dialglobal.org, and we'll look forward to seeing you again very soon.